Thanks very much for inviting me. I was very pleased to hear from you because one of the motivations for writing the book was a sense that when things go terribly wrong, not in IT necessarily, but in all areas of public life, we face so many disasters. I felt that we're not too good at the next stage, which is trying to look at, we're good at the scandal and pillory certain people, and there'll be the news reports and so on, but we're not too great at looking at how it all happened, what on earth caused this problem. So my aim with the book was to start that process in a way, to pull together what had happened, not to answer any questions really, but to raise some. So it's great to be here at an event that kind of takes that seriously. So thank you very much for inviting me. I wanted to start, if I could, just by putting John's talked about ethical concerns, to make them a bit more tangible in the context of IT, by reading to you what a judge said in the trial of Seema Misra, who was falsely imprisoned in 2010, based on flawed Horizon evidence, as we're going to talk about. His instructions to the jury included this question. He said, "Do you accept the prosecution case that there is ample evidence before you to establish that Horizon is a tried and tested system in use at thousands of post offices for several years, fundamentally robust and reliable?" The jury did, and Seema Misra was found guilty and sent to prison when she was pregnant and with a 10-year-old child. It was her son's 10th birthday, the day she was sent to prison. So that's the depth of the scandal, the problem we're dealing with, what it can mean to have false evidence, and in this case, false IT evidence. This had, by the time Seema Misra was sentenced, Computer Weekly had already written their first report in 2009. Rebecca Thompson had written a number of sort of half a dozen case studies, I think, pulling them together. But it was actually Seema Misra's case that got me onto the story, because, in one of those strange roundabout coincidences, which I've described in the book, Seema Misra's husband, Devinder, was a taxi driver in West Byfleet in Surrey, and he was listening to the radio, and the presenter one morning was Nick Wallace. And he said, call in with any stories you've got or whatever. And Devinder Misra rang him. I think he was kind of interested in the taxi account rather than any sort of story. But he got talking to Nick Wallace and said, "Well, I've got a story for you." Nick Wallace met him, was shocked by what he heard, and started his own investigations, and he put us onto it. And then I started looking at cases, including Seema Misra's and others like Joe Hamilton's. I wrote our first report, pulling them together, linking it to a long history of flawed IT projects, flawed government IT projects specifically, and saying that it looks like what we'd always treated for years. We've been writing about massive waste of money, useless IT, all this sort of stuff that you probably saw if you were a reader of the Private Eye. It looks like now this is having real consequences for people, direct consequences for people in terms of miscarriages of justice. I'll just read to you the response we got immediately from one Mike Young, who was, I think, Chief Operating Officer at Fujitsu, was his title. He said that the company, the post office, not Fujitsu. He said it takes meticulous care to ensure that the Horizon computer system in branches nationwide is fully accurate at all times, which he knew was nonsense, and anybody who had any involvement in IT knew was nonsense, because computer systems aren't fully accurate at all times. But such was the importance of not admitting to the problem, that the lies were were routine. It was the whole story was one big lie from the start, and by 2011 it had become a lie that was being parroted to media and anybody who asked. Right from the outset, you may well know that the origins of the Horizon project were not auspicious, to say the least. Starting in the mid-90s with a program to get benefit payments made through an electronic card, which would automatically feed into an accounting system, so the two would be combined. It was an era, the mid to late 90s was, an era of great hopes for IT, and the government was, governments at the time were short of money, the post-recession, and they were looking. It was one of these things that they could pin their hopes on as producing transformation in public services. So, and the DW, the Department of Health and Social Security, as it was, I think, it was a prime target. It would get this IT system. It would be set up through a private finance initiative project, which was a way of funding investment without actually borrowing money, because the governments at the time, it was actually 96, but the Labour government that came in 97 was particularly keen on PFI. And that was why, once it started, but the problem with PFI was it was later found to be totally unsuitable for IT, because there were a lot of questions about who bore what risks, and it all got extremely complicated. So they scrapped it for IT. Should have scrapped it for everything, but they scrapped it for IT a few years later. But anyway, the Horizon project went ahead. And it had to be, it should have been ditched very early on. It was clear there were massive, massive problems. I'll just read you one or two of the issues that came up. When it was all falling apart, the government brought in a chap called Adrian Montague to have a look at it. And he said he found, as early as 98, he found that there was some risk around scalability and robustness. That word again, there was risk around robustness, because the system had to be tested at the level of component parts, not as a whole. So already it was, not being set up properly, but it couldn't be sacrificed. So when the decision had to be made about what to do about this, chap called Peter Mandelson stepped in. He was a business secretary at the time, and he was, and as you know, a new Labour architect, very wedded to these new ways of doing, very wedded to the private finance initiative. And he entered the debate. Some ministers wanted to cancel it, others wanted to, fudge it and proceed with some of it and so on. He came to the debate and said that there'd been an independent review and it had found it to be robust, which was a complete lie. They hadn't. But this word robust could be used, and it would be over a couple of decades. It would be trotted out because it was a bit of a fudge, but it sounded positive. And it was, a deception. So, from the start, we were dealing with a deception. And things went, and I've set out in some detail in the book, things went from bad to worse once trials started, 98, 99. There were a series of trials, 300 branches. The prototype system was trialled in 300 branches. It got to the point where there were Fujitsu found there were, in one case, they looked at 1 week, and there were 2,451 differences between what the system said there should be in an account and what there actually was in 67 outlets. And that was just in 1 week. They knew from the outset that it was not working at the level it needed to. And that certainly it was producing errors. And in fact, they were targeting a 0.6% transaction error rate. When you think how many millions and billions of transactions were going through the post office branch network, that told them immediately that there was a lot wrong. It was so poor that Fujitsu set up a task force to look at what it could do. 98, and it was led by two the development manager and an IT auditor, and they concluded, whoever wrote this code clearly has no understanding of elementary mathematics or the most basic rules. So it was pretty damning. That was I think that was 99. So with that background and lots of other evidence, we've heard through people like that former Fujitsu employee Richard Roll. We heard who talked to Panorama many years ago about the way they operated in Fujitsu at the time. It was constantly full of bugs, errors that were being patched and mended, and there was no attempt to address the underlying problems. So this was known throughout the organisation and at, from what we can see from the inquiry, pretty senior levels. But very soon the denial at one level, at a political level, to get the project going, to sort of fudge it, to not to cause embarrassment, over £100 million, in fact, £1 billion project. That was one thing. But soon the lies started to enter the lives of sub-postmasters, those who were being suspended and prosecuted for shortfalls, which had been thrown up by the errant IT. In 2004, a woman called Julie Wolstenholme in Lancashire had a shortfall, was suspended, and took on the post office and said, well, this just isn't right, so I'm going to take you on. So she sued them. An jointly appointed independent expert came in from Jason Coyne. He said that the system was clearly defective. It was a sort of finding that was sort of undeniable given the evidence in front of them. Fujitsu engineers and managers who were dealing with him on the other side reacted to evidence came out in the inquiry that he was called a git. But actually, the man who called him a git and denied his findings was also the man who said whoever wrote this code has no idea about mathematics. So, this was the level of deception. And the level of cover-up that was there. We could go through a number of other cases, like a couple of years later, the famous one of Lee Castleton, where the post office spent hundreds of thousands of pounds because he again was taking them on, and they couldn't have someone prove that they had a ropey system. And there again, Fujitsu in this case, they went into court and lied, mostly by omission, by not telling the court about known faults, known bugs within the particular branch, within Lee Castleton's particular branch, by keeping those quiet. But the judge, in deciding the case in favour of the post office, said that the Fujitsu witness was clearly knowledgeable and reliable. So this is the power that experts have. Judges believe experts, and it's very easy, or too easy, to pull the wool over the court's eyes, which I think is something that again, so it's a slightly the legal aspects of the scandal are sort of another very important area that needs addressing, but the way that the industry expertise feeds into that, is particularly relevant for us now. I tried to address in the book a bit about look at how senior management could let this happen, because the active lying in the courts is by not junior, but not the most senior people, sort of below director level, and it was very difficult to find out why. And I think I've been very interested in some of your thoughts. Mostly, it was by looking the other way. It was turning the proverbial blind eye, and almost to the point of writing that into contracts. That Richard Christou, who was the chief executive of Fujitsu, from 2000 for about 4 years, I think. And he, before that, he'd led the negotiations on the Horizon project. And he told the inquiry that when asked about what he thought about whether the system was fit for purpose, he said that fitness for purpose was not part of the agreement, and that was a limited. He didn't even see the irony, more the dark humour in it. He just thought, well, that's fine, that's my job, So what if people went to prison? My job was to produce an IT system and get the money in. And as you say, a reference and appearance he made at the IT archives, where he was extremely proud of this project. 25 years. At the time, both for the post office and Fujitsu, the commercial incentives were quite strong. ICL, as it was until sort of turn of the millennium, Fujitsu wanted to float it. It was struggling a bit financially. There were also a huge number of government IT projects in the pipeline that it wanted to win. It couldn't afford having failure. And the Labour government also couldn't afford failure for its own reasons. So, there was an incentive not to know. At the top was an incentive not to know, which seemed to transmit through the organisations into an incentive to directly lie. And that was the situation we were in those relatively early days. The issue then is a decade after the rollout, how were they still lying to the point that that Mike Young would tell us that this system was totally reliable in the face of a wall of evidence that it wasn't? And then how would those lies go on for another few years, through the horrors of the Seema Misra case and all those convictions into the public inquiry? And that's where, again, there were a number of Fujitsu people went before in the Alan Bates before the public inquiry in the Alan Bates litigation. A number of Fujitsu officials appeared and just completely misrepresented the system, pretended all was well, trotted out lines that they'd been told. They were scripted lines, denied that they were scripted lines when they were obviously scripted lines. Really naked dishonesty in a court, which even went on to the public inquiry to some extent. The judge in the Alan Bates case in 2019 said that he had very grave concerns about the honesty of a number of Fujitsu witnesses, and they are subject to the police investigation. But what sort of challenged me a bit as I wrote this book was the question of how and why people would do that. Lying in a court, I mean, everybody knows how serious that is. It's sort of understandable if you're trying to save your own skin. If you murdered someone and you're on trial for it, you might say, I didn't do it. It wouldn't be good, but you could understand it. But in this case, it wasn't so much skin off their nose to tell the truth. I wouldn't have thought. Why would they do that? And that must be deeply in the culture of an organisation that and the groupthink. And I mean, I can't explore that too much. I tried to compare it in the book to some of the social experiments that have been conducted on what things people will do when they're given power, the awful ways that humans can behave. The explanation is difficult. What I tried to address a bit is, well, then what can you do about it? Whatever the cause, what can you do about it? And the conclusion I came to is that openness is the answer. The people who are covering up, whether in the post office or Fujitsu, I think they need to fear that someone will say what is really happening. The really, among all the statistics and numbers in this story, the one that struck me most was a big zero, and that was the number of people who had come forward during the scandal and said, look, something is wrong. Nobody, either in Fujitsu or the post office. Now, we know their cultures were badly compromised, but these weren't people, I don't believe they were people much different from you and me. So, but they were capable of doing this. How do we address it? Well, as I say, I think we need to look at much improved whistleblowing laws, so that there is an incentive even to speak out. At the moment, you speak out and your career's ruined. That's the end of it. And we need people not to be tied up by non-disclosure, confidentiality agreements, and so on. And I looked, if I can just challenge you a bit, I looked at the Chartered Institute's Code of Conduct to see what it said that was relevant here. And it says that members must not represent or withhold information on the performance of products, systems, or services. So that sounds good. And then in brackets, unless lawfully bound by a duty of confidentiality not to disclose such information. Well, it's very easy for a company to impose a duty of confidentiality. And I'm sure they did at Fujitsu, which kills any disclosure. And we end up in the situation we got to at the post office. So I think that needs a rewrite, but codes of conduct can only achieve so much. It's the big cultural change you need. And I think we in IT as elsewhere, there's a pretty urgent need to get to a position where speaking up becomes the norm and becomes a thing that's applauded rather than condemned. So on that note, I'll leave you and look forward to any questions.